I want you to take a moment and think about the best meal you've ever eaten. Got it? Now I'm going to suggest something that may be mildly offensive. The food was probably not the best part of it. I know. You remember the dish, you remember every bite, it was wonderful. But I'm willing to bet that what made it the best meal you've ever had was not just the food. It was the place, the light, the music or lack of it, the weight of the cutlery in your hand, the people across the table, the occasion, and possibly, almost certainly, the wine. Not just the food, the everything else around the food. And if you think I'm wrong, well, there's a professor at Oxford University who has spent 30 years and won a Nobel Prize, now admittedly an Ig Nobel Prize, proving exactly that. His name is Charles Spence. And this episode is about why you have absolutely no idea what you're actually tasting.
Welcome back to my BrainWise coach. I am Cole Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And we're so thrilled that you've joined us on another episode of our Neuroscience Digest series, where we digest and go into some of the newest research that's coming out in the field of neuroscience and make sense of it if needed and apply it to our everyday lives. And so if you're enjoying this particular conversation and you're having fun along this journey, please give us a 5-star review, rate us on wherever it is you're getting your podcast, and also on all of our socials. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to all of our different social platforms, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, because it helps others be able to find our growing BrainWise community. And all of our handles are mybrainwisecoach.com. And so, Phil, before we get into the science behind all of this and Ig Nobel Prize, for those who don't know, that is the prize given for research that first makes you laugh and then makes you think. What did Spence do to win it?
Well, believe it or not, he fed people Pringles, which to me, honestly, seems like a great way for a professor to spend a career. But here's the thing. He fed them Pringles while manipulating the sound of the crunch.
Wait a minute. You're telling me he manipulated the sound of the crunch?
That's exactly what he did. He fed people identical Pringles. I mean, if you've seen in the box, they're the same chip, the same batch, the same shape. Everything's the same taste. But he amplified or altered the sound of the crunch through headphones. Now get this. When the crunch was louder and higher pitched, people rated the Pringle as 15% fresher. The same chip, different sound, different experience. Now, he did indeed win the Ig Nobel Prize for this in 2008. And he has spent the last 15 years arguing, with some success, that this was not silly research at all. It was serious.
And I think this is because it demonstrated something fundamental about how taste actually works.
That's exactly what happened. Taste, or at least what we call taste, is not what happens on your tongue. It's what happens in the brain. The tongue gives the brain some raw data: sweetness, sour, salty, bitter, umami. 5 signals in all. That's all the tongue actually does. Everything else, what you call flavor, what makes one meal different from another, what makes food memorable or forgettable, is constructed by the brain from every sense simultaneously. The sound of the crunch, the color of the plate, the weight of the fork, the music in the room, the face of the person across the table. The brain takes all of that and assembles it into something it presents to you as the taste. But it was never just the taste. It was all of it, all along.
Spence calls this gastrophysics, right?
He does. Gastrophysics. Gastronomy plus psychophysics. Never heard that term before, but that's what he calls it. The science of how the mind affects the experience of eating. Once you understand it, you'll never look at a restaurant menu, a plate of food, or a glass of wine in quite the same way again.
Bill, let's go through some of these and let's start with perhaps maybe the most obvious, which would be color.
Color, it's extraordinary. Take a glass of white wine, dye it red, and give it to wine experts. They will describe it using the vocabulary of red wine. Not because they're stupid, these guys are experts, but because the color has told their brain what to expect. And the brain has used that expectation to shape what the tongue reports. The expectation is so powerful that it actually overrides the sensory signal from the tongue.
Which is effectively what happened with New Coke. People preferred Pepsi in blind tests, but put the Coke label on it, and the brain has already decided what it tastes like before the liquid reaches the mouth.
That's Spence's world colliding beautifully with Antonio Damasio's. He called it the somatic marker. The pre-conscious expectation is doing most of the work. The tongue's almost a formality. Now, let's talk about plates. I know it's not your favorite subject, but round plates versus square plates.
I know you're going to tell me that there's some sort of difference in the two, right?
Indeed, there is. Round plates make food taste sweeter. Square plates or angular shapes are associated more with bitterness. No one knows exactly why, but apparently it's consistent across cultures. Sweet tastes are round, bitter tastes are angular. The brain has mapped shapes onto flavors, and it does this automatically without asking your permission.
Well, of course not. No permission. And what about the color of the plate?
Well, white plates make food taste sweeter than black plates. Dark plates are associated with intensity and bitterness, which means that agonized decision that every restaurant designer makes about plateware is not purely aesthetic. It's literally changing what the food tastes like.
This is starting to feel like the universe is slightly less solid, perhaps, than I thought it was.
Hang on tight, it gets worse. Or perhaps better, depending on your perspective. Cutlery weight. Heavy cutlery makes food taste better. More expensive, more premium. People rate yogurt as creamier when eaten with a heavier spoon than a lighter, for example, a plastic one. Same yogurt. Spence has tested this with cheese, with toffee, and with any number of other foods. The weight of what you're holding affects what you're tasting. The brain is integrating that, what we call haptic signal, that physical signal, the feel of the implement into the flavor experience.
So, I have to ask, what happens with furry cutlery, which I'm not sure I've ever used, but what happens with that?
I've never been asked that question before, but I'm glad you asked. Spence actually did this. He and a colleague wrapped the handles of silver cutlery in a hair pelt and served food with them at a dinner party. Apparently was, and I'm going to quote here, truly a most multisensory of experiences, unquote. I'm choosing to believe this as a positive assessment, by the way. The Italian Futurists in the 1930s, this is an arcane piece, recommended turning up to dinner, and I'm sure you're going to do this, in wearing your pajamas made from satin, silk, velvet, and sandpaper, and eating food.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly what you'd think, right? Eating food without cutlery by burying your face in the plate. Well, get this, rubbing your neighbor's pajamas. I bet you never had a conversation like this before.
Certainly not. And I do have to say, depending on where you placed the sandpaper in your pajama set, it could make the experience far more uncomfortable. So I imagine his dinner parties were quite extraordinary,
I
depending on
imagine they were. Maybe we should just generate one and have a dinner party like this.
Everyone has to wear sandpaper.
He has described these dinner parties that he's held with a tone generator, headphones, and 10 kinds of beer lined up on the ironing board to test whether different beers have different pitches, partly for fun and partly to get his students thinking, which, as I understand it, is normal for a Saturday night in Oxford, England.
Speaking of sound, the background music, because this is the one that I find the most counterintuitive, is that the music in the room is changing the taste of the food, right?
It is. It's changing the taste of the food. High-pitched music, tinkling, wind chimes, high strings, that brings out sweetness. Low-pitched music, brass, bass, slow, heavy, that brings out bitterness and intensity. Spence and Blumenthal developed what they call sonic seasoning, pairing music to dishes at the Fat Duck restaurant specifically to enhance particular flavor qualities. The dish, called Sound of the Sea, came with an iPod playing waves and seagulls. Diners who got the seaside soundtrack rated the seafood as significantly tastier than those who got regular background music. Same food, same plate, different sound, different taste.
I'm now thinking about every restaurant that I've actually ever been to and whether the music was actively ruining the meal. And I will say that from a perspective of if I'm going to an Italian restaurant or, a specific style of restaurant, I do have an expectation that they're playing music that relates to that particular culture, the food that they're presenting or selling. So it totally makes sense.
Yeah, and it almost certainly has had an impact. Spence is quite pointed about this. He says chefs care passionately about every ingredient, every technique. Then the duty manager on the floor in the front of the house just puts their phone onto shuffle and doesn't care. It detracts from everything that's been done in the kitchen. The music is part of the meal. It always was part of the meal. Most restaurants treat it as just background furniture.
And something that I found interesting about the research, Phil, is that you mentioned people that are drinking tomato juice in the air, meaning on an airplane, actually found out that it tasted better, that they enjoyed it. Is that correct?
It's one of my favorite findings of Mr. Spence, or should I say Professor Spence. At altitude, cabin noise suppresses sweet and salty taste receptors, but it enhances umami taste, the savory fifth taste. Tomato juice is high in umami, so the same tomato juice that tastes flat and slightly medicinal on the ground tastes rich and satisfying in the air. The plane is doing your seasoning for you, if you like. Now, airlines know this, and some are using it deliberately, designing menus around the flavor profile that altitude and noise create rather than fighting it.
There's a through line here that connects everything we talk about in our BrainWise discussions. The brain is a prediction machine. It is not passively receiving the taste of the food. Instead, it is predicting what the food is going to taste like before it arrives, and then constructing our experience to match that prediction.
It's exactly what Spence says, yes. He argues that the brain decides before you put anywhere near your mouth or in your mouth what it's going to taste like, whether you're going to like it, how expensive it seems, how fresh, how authentic, all those things. The actual sensory signal from the tongue is almost like a check, a near enough confirmed check, rather than the source of the experience, which is why setting the right expectations, as he puts it, is so important. You're not managing the food when you set the table and choose the music and light the candles. You're managing the brain that's about to eat the food.
Which is also why the same wine tastes better on a Spanish beach than it does perhaps when you bring it home.
Yeah, he's studied this formally. He calls it the vacation effect, or the Côte de Rhône syndrome. The rosé you drank on a terrace at sunset, enhanced by the warm light, the relaxed state, the holiday identity you were having, the sound of the sea, the company, your loved one, whatever it was, you bring the same bottle home to your kitchen on a Tuesday evening, and the brain has none of those cues to build the same experience. The wine's identical. The brain's prediction, however, is entirely different. So the experience and the taste of the wine is entirely different.
This also probably explains why your grandmother's or our grandmother's cooking always tastes better than anyone else's version of the exact same recipe.
That's indeed true. Memory is one of the most powerful flavor enhancers available. The brain encodes emotionally significant eating experiences in the amygdala with particular intensity. The smell of that dish that your grandmother cooked arrives at the brain already loaded with decades of encoded warmth, safety, and belonging. The brain's not tasting the food, it's tasting the memory. The food's the trigger for that memory.
Which means that in an interesting way, that the most important ingredient in any great meal is what happened before the meal.
And what he says is the pleasure of food lies mostly in the mind, not in the mouth. Get that straight, and you can start to understand what really makes food enjoyable, stimulating, and memorable. The mouth, I hate to use this phrase, it's just the door. That's what he says. The experience happens entirely behind it.
I've got a practical question for you. What does any of this mean for how we actually eat?
It means a few things. First, if you're cooking for people, you're designing an experience, not just preparing the dish. The table matters. The light matters. The music matters. The weight of the glasses matter. None of this needs to be expensive or elaborate. A heavier fork costs the same as a light one. Candles cost almost nothing. Putting on music that matches the mood of the meal takes 30 seconds. You're not being pretentious. You're being neurologically literate.
And you said first, so what's second?
Eat with other people. Just that's as simple as that. Spence's data shows that we consume 35% more food when eating with one other person and 75% more with three others. Some of that's social facilitation.
Bill, can I interrupt you really quick on that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to eat with other people then, because I don't want to go outwards.
Well, this is what the data suggests. So what you do with it is up to you. But
Right.
some of that is what we call social facilitation. We pace ourselves with others and our eating slows down. We tend to eat more. If other people are eating more, we tend to join them. But some of that is the social environment, and it enhances the pleasure of the experience, and the brain extends the pleasure by extending the eating. The best meals are not just well cooked, they're well accompanied.
And what about wine on the plane?
Order the Bloody Mary. Trust the science. And if anybody asks you why, tell them an Oxford professor won a prize for feeding people Pringles, and it all leads to that. Ordering the Bloody Mary.
You know, Bill, I came into this thinking we were going to talk about taste, and I'm leaving it mildly suspicious of my entire sensory life or experience.
Well, that's a good response. Professor Spence's book is called Gastrophysics, The New Science of Eating. And it's one of the most enjoyable pieces of popular science I've ever encountered. It's accessible, it's funny, and constantly surprising. And if you want the deeper argument about how brain constructs reality from expectation rather than sensation, which is what all of this is really about, that's what BrainWise is here for.
The next time that you have a dinner party, put on the right music, use the heavy cutlery, and if the food is mediocre, nobody's going to notice.
Well, that's not exactly what he says, but it's not entirely wrong either.
With that, if you enjoyed our podcast and our discussion today all around taste, we encourage you to like, comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social platforms. Give us a 5-star rating and review us wherever it is that you get your podcasts. And until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay brainwise.